Hi everyone. Today we are going to be talking about white collar crime. This is lecture 15. Okay, so to start, I want everyone to have an understanding of some definitions. When we're talking about white collar crime, often people refer to things as white collar crimes that in actuality sometimes are, sometimes should not be considered falling under that category. So, if you're thinking about white collar crime, the way the criminologists define this phrase is any any criminal act, any violation of law that's committed by a person or a group of people in the course of an otherwise respected or legitimate occupation. Sorry. So white collar crime can be done by one person, it can be done by multiple people. But the key to what makes an offense a white collar crime is if you're committing it in the course of an otherwise respectable job. So there's a couple different types of white collar crimes that people study and refer to. First of all, you've got occupational crime, and this is the low level stuff. This is white collar crime committed usually by an individual during the rendering of his services. So if you have an individual who's embezzling money, who's defrauding customers, things like that, that would be an example of an occupational crime. And the larger scale version of white collar crime would be corporate crime, which we define as crimes being committed by more than one employee, and you can actually attribute their commission to the organization itself. In other words, there was kind of an organizational um, understanding that this kind of activity was going on was okay. If not everybody in the organization, at least several people within the organization. So there have been a lot of really famous white collar crime cases in the past several years, a lot of times because some of the larger corporate crime level cases have billion-dollar impacts on the rest of society. So you guys are all probably familiar with the Enron scandal that happened several years ago. There's a couple other ones that I put up here that are maybe a little bit even more current. The gentleman at the bottom left of the slide is Bernard Madoff, who's an American stockbroker. He pled guilty a few years ago to 11 felony counts of fraud, and he was guilty of essentially defrauding investors of his company out of billions of dollars. At the top right-hand side of the slide, you have a shot taken from the oil spill down in Louisiana in the Gulf of Mexico a few years ago, and BP, the gasoline company, the fuel company, had to pay millions of dollars in damages after the oil spill. So that's an example of the reason that I have it up here in terms of white collar crime is basically the fault that was identified in this case was kind of a company-wide gradually lowering of standards of conduct. And the shot taken at the bottom right there is a picture of the mayor of Gulfport, Mississippi, Brent Warr, and his wife. And after Hurricane Katrina, uh, the Mayor Warr, was accused of seeking a relief grant to repair he and his wife's vacation home. So all of these people that were seeking relief to repair, decimation of their homes in Mississippi and Louisiana area, he unfortunately tried to take advantage of that by getting money to repair a second home, a vacation home. And he pled guilty in 2009 and got 3 years probation and about $10,000 in fines. And all the charges against his wife were dropped. So these are some examples of some famous cases, and people tend to be very interested in white collar crime cases, usually because they involve so much money, often because they involve rather intricate types of crimes that take a long time to kind of unfold and act. And I think also a lot of the interest around these is the fact that some of these people are not maybe people you would consider stereotypical or highly likely to be committing crime. Not a lot of the people who are committing these kinds of crimes fit into some of the demographic characteristics and the neighborhood level background factors that more traditional theories of crime would allege are key indicators. So the phrase white collar crime wasn't a phrase that was recognized or used in the United States or anywhere else uh, earlier in the 20th century. It took a couple scholars to kind of identify this crime as a problem and draw attention to it before anyone really paid much mind to it. Now, the conventional wisdom, especially in the early 20th century anyway, is that crime is a lower class phenomenon. If you think back to a lot of the theories of crime that we've talked about so far in this course, a lot of them are kind of assuming that most of the people we should care about, most of our concern, should be about young, urban, inner city, lower class boys. Um, and that was a conventional wisdom for a long time because if you think back to all of those kind of sociological theories, sociological explanations for crime, crime was kind of linked to a whole array of other social ills and social problems. So it took a little bit of a while in this country for people to really think about white collar criminals and white collar crime as an actual problem. Edwin Sutherland, if you remember, Edwin Sutherland is the theorist who wrote differential association theory. He was really the first person in his first criminology textbook, which he wrote back in the 1930s and then another edition in 1940, first got to really define this term, white collar criminal. And in his book, he wrote a book in 1940 called White Collar Crime, where he analyzed essentially 70 legal violations of the 70 largest countries in the United States. And these were countries that on average had been in operation for about 45 years. So he basically took kind of a survey of these companies, all of which who had committed some kind of white collar offense in the past couple years, and tried to understand what was going on in these companies. And first of all, he was the first person to really define white collar crime as crimes being committed in the course of an occupation. For him, that's what it had to entail for you to call it this white collar crime. Another kind of interesting thing about his definition of this crime is that it's a crime that's undertaken by a person of respectability. Those are his words from his book. And again, it's a little bit unusual to have that in the description of an offense. But for him, the reason that we call white collar crime is it was committed by businessmen, men of respectability, men who literally wear, suits and white button-up shirts to work each day and are committing their crimes in the course of that job, doing something kind of underneath the level, on the side, during the course of their normal occupation. So that was his first kind of definition. It's committed by people of respectability in the course of their occupation. That's kind of a weakly defined concept when you think about it. What does it mean to be a person of respectability? So it was a little bit weak for a start, but it was a start in this area. And incidentally, what he found when he surveyed those large industrial companies that he examined for his book, he found that each company that he examined had been convicted of some kind of white collar offense, and they averaged about 14 violations. So in other words, the reason that he wrote this book is he was trying to draw attention to a type of crime that largely goes unnoticed, at least in the 1930s and 40s, went fairly unnoticed. So this issue that people's perception of white-collar criminals is somewhat different really held and stayed fairly the same up until the mid-1960s. Essentially, what was going on up until then in terms of white-collar crime research is nothing. Nobody was doing any research on it. Nobody really cared about this type of offending. So up until the 1960s, the perception about white-collar criminals was people were essentially indifferent about this kind of crime. People saw it as a gentleman's crime, and they saw it as just being much less serious than predatory street crime. if you think back to some of the theories we've talked about in this class so far, you know, what we were concerned about back in the 1950s and 60s was gangs, was young hoodlum boys, essentially. If you read, the language of the people writing at the time, they describe the crime problem as being a problem of the lower classes, a problem of urban decay. Nobody was really interested in talking about what kind of elitist, rich businessmen might be doing that technically is illegal. People just didn't really care that much about it. In a President's Commission on Law Enforcement and the Administration of Justice in 1968, um, there's a quote from that commission's report addressing white collar crime. So they had sections of this commission. This was a commissioned report by the president to assess the state of our knowledge about crime and criminal justice. And they essentially had a paragraph about white collar crime in which they said that the public tends to be indifferent to business crime or even sympathize with offenders who have been caught. So that kind of gives you an idea to the public sentiment at the time. People saw white collar offenders as being basically like them, and any little offenses that they're doing isn't as bad as some of the violent predatory behavior going on the streets. James Q. Wilson also addressed this issue in a very influential book in 1975 called Thinking About Crime. And essentially, he basically played into this sense of indifference by saying that, what we should be really concerned about is, and what the conviction of most citizens is that predatory street crime is far more serious than things like fraud and antitrust violations. If we're going to focus our punishment efforts somewhere, we should focus it on the index offenses, on rape, robbery, murder, assault, and not things like fraud and embezzlement.